Each and every one of you connected to MIT really forces for good in a significant way. Thank each and every one of you for coming out this evening. This is going to be much more dialogical and conversational, really. I'm not here to pontificate. I don't know that much about the internal dynamics of MIT. If it's in any way similar to Harvard University, then we all got a lot of work to do. Very much so, because this is, like Harvard, one of the great institutions of the American empire. A variety of different viewpoints, visions, voices. That's what liberal education is all about. How do you come to terms with the quest for truth and goodness and beauty in such a way that you can engage in disagreement and still mediate it with respect, but recognize that much is at stake. It's not a game. It's not a puzzle. We're talking about the future and destiny, the species, human beings, sentient beings, and so forth and so on. Now, I know this is Black History Month, and for me, you talk about Black history, you know, you're talking about sacred ground, because you're talking about my mother and my father and my grandparents. And I am who I am because somebody loved me, somebody cared for me, somebody attended to me. Before I arrived at Harvard and Princeton and so forth, I already had folk who had engaged in the shaping of who I am and provided a certain mode of soul craft. The Irene and Clifton West and Shiloh Baptist Church and Reverend Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton and Sarah Ray, my Sunday school teacher. I was already fortified before I was then able to study with the Hillary Putnams and the John Rawls and the Robert Nozick's and others in that illustrious philosophy department in the early 70s, and then on to Princeton with Richard Rorty and Sheldon Wolin and Walter Kaufman and Tim Scanlon and Thomas Nagel and Gregory Vlastos. These are all towering figures. They mean the world to me. The Israel Schefflers at Harvard. In fact, when I think about them, I have to just pause. But they're part of the same continuum as my family, my church folk, members of the Black Panther Party. I couldn't join the party because I'm a revolutionary Christian, but they were my comrades. They were radically secular, atheistic to the core, so they could be my allies, but they wouldn't allow me to join, and I can understand that. Everybody's got their dogmatism and provincialism and parochialism. You know, when I arrived here at Harvard, I went straight to Jamaica Plain, where we had the breakfast program for the Black Panther Party and the prison program at Norfolk, where I taught for every Sunday for the 3 years that I was here. Why is this important? Not because it's about me, but because we live in one of the bleakest moments in the history of this empire. And it's really a testing of who we are, what kind of heart, mind, and souls we really have. It's not just a matter of what we talk about, not just a matter of chit-chat, but what we're willing to risk. What kind of choices we make in such a way that we're willing to actually pay a cost. Antonio Gramsci called it a critical historical self-inventory. But I begin with the legacy of Athens. And Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living for a human, at line 38a of Plato's Apology. And I take that very, very seriously. But you can hear echoes in Black History Month to Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. The examined life is painful. Very, very painful. Montaigne said the philosophizers learn how to die. Seneca says he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. See, for me, any serious talk about an educational institution, and I draw a fundamental distinction between what the Greeks call paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A. That's deep education. It's very deep and different than cheap schooling. And I know cheap schooling is not what MIT is about. You're all about paideia. But all of you about paideia, that learning how to die in order to learn how to live, to engage in that Socratic self-examination, self-interrogation in such a way that you can engage in the formation of attention, attend to the things that really matter and turn your back to those things that are distractions. We live in a culture with massive weapons of distraction. How do you turn away from the superficial things on the surface, deal with life, death, joy, sorrow, justice, trust, those non-market values, those values that are preconditions for markets, but they're also far beyond simply the meritocratic. Because I come from a tradition of a people who, after being terrorized for 400 years, still taught the world so much about freedom. Frederick Douglass could have said, I'm not against slavery per se. I just want to enslave other folk because I don't like being enslaved. No, he wanted freedom for everybody. A certain kind of soul craft. Ida Wells Barnett, when they put the bounty on her head, thousands of dollars, she had to leave the country and go to England fighting against American terrorism called Jim Crow and Jane Crow and lynching. She could have said, I will engage in lynching others who are lynching my friends. No, she said, I was shaped in such a way that I want freedom for everybody. And after 400 years of being chronically and systemically hated, black bodies, black character, black mind, black beauty, hated, demonized, we black folk at our best, we've taught the world so much about how to love. And I could just put on John Coltrane's Love Supreme and just sit down and let you take it in. Listen to those notes. Listen to Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, every note, every silence between the notes. Has there ever been a figure on the stage in this country with More Love Than Mama, written by a genius in the south side of Chicago named Lorraine Hansberry, in her 20s, a raisin in the sun? It doesn't take anything away from other towering figures, the Arthur Millers and the Tennessee Williams and Eugene O'Neills, but there's never been that much love on the American stage. Same is true with James Baldwin's love-soaked essay. Same is true with Toni Morrison's Beloved. Same is true with Stevie Wonder. Same is true with Erykah Badu. And Brother Kendrick's working on it, isn't he? Oh, I love that brother. That's Socratic wrestling. Paideia in the sonic mode. Brother Malcolm knows what I'm talking about. It's a blessing to see him. There's two brilliant brothers sitting next to each other at MIT, and his beloved mother's a very distinguished professor as well. But the same tradition, though, Brother Malcolm. You know who you were named after. That Malcolm X, who was a gangster when he was a teenager, a Malcolm Little. But that love transformed him. The love of an honorable Elijah Muhammad transformed him. And what did he do? He shattered his provincialism. He shattered his parochialism. He kept growing. He was Socratic to the core. And he learned how to die in order to learn how to live by scrutinizing himself and allowing, through a formation of attention and the cultivation of a critical self and the maturation of a loving soul, to bear witness, to be a truth teller. And he echoed line 24a of Plato's Apology, where Socrates says what? Parrhesia, Parrhesia. Parrhesia was the cause of my unpopularity. What is parrhesia, Socrates? Frank speech, plain speech, fearless speech, unintimidated speech. Yes, it will get you in trouble. But just not any speech. But it's got to be rooted in the best of paideia. It's got to be rooted in the best of deep education. But the soul craft that I already was shaped in before I arrived at Harvard 48 years ago was one that engaged a kind of culture shock. Because even then, I was running into young brothers and sisters of different colors who were thoroughly convinced that the end and aim of life was, for the most part, to be the smartest in the room. And I said to myself, we come from a different tradition. I don't fetishize smartness, just like I don't worship meritocratic formulations. Now, I'm not promoting stupidity. I want to be clear about that. But no, we got to let the phones be smart. We got to be wise. Let the computers be smart. We got to be courageous. Nothing wrong. Technological ingenuity, nothing wrong with magnificent breakthroughs. But the question is, in the end, what kind of human being are you in your short trek from your mama's womb to tomb, and are you willing to engage in paideia at the deepest level, which has to do with your soul, your character. It has to do with the kind of person you will be and what will be said about you when your body is in that coffin or after your ashes are spread over whatever body of water that you so desire. What does it mean to be human? That Latin humando, which means burial. We're on our way to burial. The culinary delight of terrestrial worms. What I love about the black tradition is that we always believe in trying to keep it funky, which means we're highly suspicious of deodorized discourse. That's crucial. Sanitized disc. Look at how they sanitize Martin every January. Sterilized Malcolm. Mainstream all of these freedom fathers. Never confuse a love warrior and a freedom fighter with a polished professional. Because most polished professionals fetishize smartness and end up being well-adjusted to injustice and well-adapted to indifference. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say with such tremendous insight, indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. So no matter how smart you are, no matter how rich you are, if you're not willing to engage in parrhesia, frank speech, a plain speech, doesn't have to be public. It can be microsocial, on the job, in your synagogue, in your mosque, in your trade union, in your university. A force for good, in the language of John Coltrane. That's what it means to bring to bear the best of black history. And I keep saying the best because black history includes black gangsters, black thugs. Every community has it. Black haters, black xenophobes, black patriarchs, black homophobes, black transphobes. I got many in my family. People ask me all the time, how could you call Donald Trump a gangster on TV every 2 weeks? I said, because he is. But I'm not engaging in name calling. A gangster is not a subjective expression, that's an objective condition. It's true. If you grabbing private parts of somebody, that's gangster. Another country got oil and you say you ought to get it, that's gangster. You see, as I said before, I'm a revolutionary Christian, which means that I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and now I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. So when I call Trump a gangster, I'm talking about something inside of me. Trump is American as cherry pie. It's misogyny and white supremacy and transphobia and class arrogance and obsession with smartness, obsession with riches, ignorance flowing in the name of his claim to be smartness. He doesn't have a monopoly on that. Comes out of a long history. And black folk always keep track of it. And this is one of the challenges to a place like MIT and Harvard and others. Because one of the distinctive features of most American institutions is that we're in denial of the catastrophic and obsessed with the problematic. So everything's reduced to a problem rather than a catastrophe. There's never been such a thing as the race problem in America. There's been a series of catastrophes visited on black people. That's not a problem. No such thing as a woman's problem. There's been a catastrophe, a series of visited on women, working class people. The labor problem. No. That's from the vantage point of capital. That's from the vantage point of Wall Street. We're talking about the workers themselves dealing with daily life, wrestling with catastrophic circumstances. No such thing as an immigrant problem. So I was in Arizona just a couple of days ago, and everybody so upset. Mexicans coming in. Shoot, Arizona used to be Mexico. What you talking about? They just coming home. Mexican War, one of the most trumped up, unjustified wars. And that's from the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. We're not talking about a radical anti-imperialist like Mark Twain. We're talking about somebody who fought in the war. He said this was a bogus war. This was a land grab, a power grab. That's what imperialism is. That's what the expansion of U.S. empire is. That's what it has been at its worst. We always want to keep track of the best and the worst. Any tradition, any group, the best inside it, the best of me, the worst of me. Now, what does that have to do with institutional provincialism? It means that from the very beginning, as we enter the dialogue, we first enter the dialogue with what we could call loosely hermeneutical humility. That the various interpretations that we put forward ought to be put forward in such a way that we recognize that we could be wrong as well as right. And we take each other seriously when we acknowledge that each one of us could be wrong or right. That's what it means to be a jazz woman or a blues man. To learn how to lift your voice, but also to listen. Not just hear in the abstract, but listen. Because paideia, education, is about what? Transformation. Cheap schooling, just information. Never confuse the two. Information, indispensable. Information, necessary, not a sufficient condition for paideia. And hermeneutics, interpretation, self-invested interpretation. So when you talk about catastrophe, you begin with ecological catastrophe, impending, escalating every day. Nuclear catastrophe, increasing, especially with both Kim and Trump. Two gangsters. Possibility, pushing the button. We haven't even talked about Russia and other countries with nuclear arms. What a bleak moment. Economic catastrophe. What is it now? The top 3 individuals in this empire have wealth equivalent to 50% of our fellow citizens, 160 million people. Well, Brother West, they're very smart and they worked hard. Oh, please. Please. Salute their smartness, their intelligence. We're talking about structures. We're talking about institutions in place. We're talking about policies that generate massive redistribution of wealth from poor and working people to the well-to-do. When I was the age of many of the young brothers and sisters who are undergrads right now at MIT, and we were struggling against the 1%, they had 21% of the wealth. Today, 1% got 41% of the wealth. That's a massive redistribution of wealth upward. And it continues. Under Obama, 1% of the population got 95% of the income growth. People ask me why I was upset with the black president. Please. I love blackness, but not enough to blind me and render me insensitive to the suffering of poor and working people. I don't care what color. And I'm stuck with the old-fashioned view that a precious baby in Yemen or Afghanistan or Pakistan or Somalia has the same value as a vanilla baby in Newtown, Connecticut, or a red baby in Standing Rock, or a brown baby on the east side of Los Angeles, or a black baby in Dorchester. Same value. Same righteous indignation, same moral outrage when innocent people are being killed. It could be a drone strike. It could be a police, man or woman. It could be a fellow citizen. Innocent folk killed. And a precious Jewish baby in Tel Aviv has exactly the same value as a precious Palestinian baby in the West Bank or in Gaza, and vice versa. And if you really believe that, then it's going to pit you over against much of the mainstream discourse. And I think that's exactly what paideia at its best does. That's why we love Socrates at a distance. We love the intellectual operation. We don't love the hemlock moment. That's why we love Amos, the legacy of Jerusalem, and Jeremiah. That's why we love Jesus and Muhammad in the world, but not of it. Willing to keep track of forms of provincialism and parochialism, narrow horizons, narrow-mindedness, the lack of what the great Jane Austen called constancy. What is constancy? Moral and spiritual consistency. So you're not obsessed with just one issue. Concerned just about racism, can't say a mumbling word about misogyny and sexism. Concerned about patriarchy, can't say a mumbling word about transphobia or precious transfolk. Or concerned about America, and can't say a mumbling word about imperial policies of 4,857 military units that we have, 857 around the world, 145 countries we have U.S. special operations in, and keep track of what they're doing, from detentions to night raids to so forth and so on. That's a major challenge. It's a crucial challenge. All of us fall short. Samuel Beckett is right. Try again, fail better. He puts in this last piece of fiction, worst word whole. Try again, fail better. But right now, at the moment of this empire, we are witnessing colossal, escalating failure. Failure of imagination, failure of sensitivity, failure of concern with the vulnerable. And yet, certain institutions, the Harvard, MIT, University of Chicago's, flourishing. So the question becomes, MIT, what you gonna do? And by MIT, we're not talking about abstract institution. We're talking about the folk who constitute this place. What kind of human beings are you gonna choose to be? What levels of discipline? What kinds of attentions? William James, the most adorable of all public intellectuals in the history of this empire, he used to say, experiences very much define what you attend to. There's a wonderful book by Tim Wu called The Attention Merchants, just published a couple of years ago. All of the institutional efforts to try to make sure that we don't attend to the things that matter, the advertising, enterprises and so forth, all tied to money making, all tied to profit maximizing, all tied to growth without necessarily defining what the moral and spiritual quality of that growth is vis-a-vis the planet in which we find ourselves, or vis-a-vis those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. Catastrophe. I used to acknowledge to my beloved colleagues in philosophy departments. I said, if somebody dropped down from Mars and talked about the crisis of the American empire, would your subject matter have anything to do with that? Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, Charlottesville today, white supremacy, escalating, running amok. Are these departments wrestling with the vicious legacies of white supremacy? Oh, well, we've got somebody teaching a course on diversity. Well, that's not that. No, that's not that. No, that's not what I'm talking about. No, diversity is part of the deodorized discourse I'm talking about. Nothing wrong with it. All bureaucrats need constructs. But on the ground, diversity is about male supremacy and its vicious effects. It's about white supremacy and its vicious consequences. It's about class privilege, which even in a highly colorful silo, a highly colorful context, the issue of class cannot be downplayed. Same is true with empire. You see. Catastrophe. For me, someone who teaches at Divinity School and Afro-American Studies, the issue of soulcraft, the issue of moral and spiritual dimensions of our individual lives, of our collective lives, sits at the center of it. Because there will be no fight back. And I'm very much concerned about fight back. There will be no fight back if we don't produce people who are willing to take a stand. Willing to take a stand. Emerson talks about this in Self-Reliance. Right? The aversion to conformity. The willingness to stand out and stand for. Over against a status quo that so often is so preoccupied with reproducing itself that it takes a major catastrophe or crisis for it to acknowledge, lo and behold, it ought to come to terms with some realities that are being hidden and concealed. You see? The moral and spiritual dimensions. And that's a challenge to all of my brothers and sisters here of all colors at MIT. You see? How do you not just talk about it, but enact a sensitivity to the vulnerable in your curriculum, in your own praxis, in your organizational affiliations? No one of us can do everything. No one of us is Messiah. We've got one life to live. But it's got to be part and parcel of the soul craft. Now, Walt Whitman called it democratic soul craft vis-a-vis a market-driven soul craft. I would submit that the neoliberal soul craft has become so hegemonic these days, it's hard to think outside of it. And the neoliberal soul craft is what I said before, the smartest and the richest. That's all you need. That's all you need. You notice, for example, when you watch television, how many times people use the word obviously, obviously, obviously this, obviously that, obviously, and it's not obvious sometimes at all. I said to myself, some linguist needs to engage in an anthropological investigation as a deployment of that word, because it's a word of in-crowd smartness. Because if it's not obvious to you, then you're the one who feel dumb. And it's not just a word to connect other words. It's a way of wanting to be included in the smart crowd. And I thank God that I was raised in such a way that I have a deep suspicion of folk who are just smart. Because there's a whole lot of smart misogynists out there. A whole lot of smart folk who hate Jews and hate Arabs. And they got a long history of smart white supremacists. Very smart, sophisticated, well-read. But crushed my grandmama. And I said, oh, I got my hermeneutics of suspicion, not just hermeneutics humility. I'm very, very Socratic in terms of my willingness to question what kind of assumptions and presuppositions are being put forward by those who are denying catastrophic realities and claim to be so smart involved in problem solving. And I'm not against problem solving. I come out in some ways of tradition of American pragmatism of a certain kind that's obsessed with problem solving. But I come from a people whose first experience in the modern world is massive catastrophe. It's been at work ever since. Continues today. And usually the country doesn't attend to it unless there is a major challenge. Often of a violent sort. When I arrived at Harvard in 1970, they admitted 91 black students. 4 years earlier, they admitted six. And you say, oh, they had an intellectual renaissance in the black community, huh? All of a sudden, they just started admitting all these black folk. No, you had massive rebellions on April 5th, 1968, when Brother Martin Luther King Jr. was shot down like a dog on that porch in Memphis. 150 cities burning. Almost shut down the White House, or de-whitified the White House, or blackenized the White House. First time they had to use the National Guard to protect the White House since the 19th century. And then these institutions said, I think we really do have a problem. We're going to have to do something about this. We need some diversity programs. Oh, my God. These black folk running out of control. And then what happens the next month? September. New York Times Magazine, model minority, Asian brothers and sisters. Oh, we like them. They're so silent and seemingly deferential. They're not like Jamal and Letitia. No, Brother Kim No, sister, no. Well, they don't know nothing about the history of Asian peoples. It's a construct, juxtaposed and contrasted with this rebellious folk, angry black people. No, we want those minorities that come in very, very quiet. Don't want to raise too much hell. Just want to fit in and assimilate. Now, you don't know what they're doing when they get home. You say, oh, you bring in the Indian brothers and sisters and Indochina, Japan, and Korean. They're going to put the Koreans and the Japanese together. Please read the history. Oh, God. Imperial vicious. All of them under the same construct in America. That's the deodorized discourse. Asians. No, they got specificity. They got heterogeneity. Vast diversity. Going to put them all under, but juxtapose it to these black folk. Because they're the ones out of control. How come? Because they will straighten their backs up and they'll tell some truths. At their best. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have a long history of black assimilation. Long history of black folk getting in, so glad to get in, smiling, laughing when it ain't funny, scratching when it don't itch, wearing the mask just to fit in. Paul Lawrence Dunbar talked about that. We wear the mask just to fit in. No, we got a history of misfits. History of those who are oppositional, not for opposition's sake, but because they are fundamentally committed to a form of democratic soulcraft that puts a premium on integrity, constancy, honesty, courage, fortitude. Fortitude, according to the Romans, is the fusion of courage and magnanimity, of courage and greatness of character, fortitude. That when you talk about soulcraft in this country, you have to talk about the arts, because the last thing you want is a lot of nerdy brothers and sisters running around being smart with no access to the arts. That is a dystopia of grand proportion. By the arts, I'm talking about the music, the paintings, and so forth and so on. They're not ornamental or decorative. They ought to be constitutive. And you can't talk about the history of white supremacy in this country without talking about resistance to white supremacy. And music has been, the musical tradition has been the grandest example, because it's there where you get more of the truth-telling. It's there where you get the vulnerability. It's there where you get the risks and so forth and so on. It's one of the reasons why when I began talking about Coltrane, I could have talked about Donny Hathaway. I could have talked about Aretha Franklin. I could have talked about Mahalia Jackson or Curtis Mayfield. Hard these days to keep track of the enhancing impact of black music on black folk and others. There's been a spiritual warfare against young black folk especially, to make sure that the music is not sweet and kind and gentle. We just lost Dennis Edwards. You all know who Dennis Edwards was? He comes out of Alabama, from Mighty Clouds of Joy, and he replaced a David Ruffin from Why Not, Mississippi, who sang lead for the Temptations. Well, what was it about the Temptations or the Miracles? What was it about the main ingredient? What was it about the Delphonics or the Dramatics or the Jones Girls? What was it about the Hutchison Sisters of the Emotions? What was it about the groups who sang in tune with a sweetness and a kindness that stirred the soul rather than just stimulated the body? And these days, the dumbing down of the music is part and parcel of the dumbing down of the soul that makes it difficult to produce persons who are willing to fight, who are willing to sacrifice. Because if it's all about stimulation and titillation, you see, when Otis Redding said, try a little tenderness, that's not say my name, say my name, say my name. It's a very different disposition toward the world. It's a very different orientation toward the world. And there is no black history without a love of truth, and the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak, anybody's suffering. There's no black history without a love of goodness, keeping track of the evil, the undeserved harm, a love of beauty, and Rilke is right. Beauty is, in fact, produced wrestling with terror and trauma and transfiguring your pain and suffering into a sound, a painting, a building. And there's certainly no love of the holy for those of us who are religious, be you Muslim or Buddhist or Christian or whatever you are. There's no love of the holy without wrestling with the degree to which we are aspiring but fall short, tied to something bigger than ourselves. One of the reasons why I spend a lot of time in studios with hip-hop artists is to try to convince them that to fall in love with truth and beauty and goodness, to be a love warrior at the highest level, and then master your craft, then master your technique, then be as smart as you want to be, acknowledging the limitations of smartness, spilling into wisdom. Then we have a chance to deal with the catastrophes. That was what was beautiful about the Occupy movement. That was beautiful about the various marches we've had recently against Donald Trump. Beautiful about movement for black lives and beautiful what would be the right words? The rich ecological movement, my dear brother McKibben and Naomi Klein and the others. And I know many have played an important role here at MIT as professors and staff and students. But the challenge is, given this institutional context, can we wrestle with the forms of provincialism, parochialism? Can we be true to the best of the Socratic legacy of Athens? Can we be true to the best of the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem? Can we be true to the best of the democratic legacy of not just the United States, but other social experiments as we keep track of empire, white supremacy, misogyny, transphobia, all of those ideologies that lose sight of the preciousness and pricelessness of each and every one of us. Thank you all so very much. Towering intellectual was my teacher. His name was Thomas Kuhn, who taught here at MIT for many years, but he taught at Princeton before he arrived here. And I'm sure students still read Structural Scientific Revolution. Is that right? Is that required reading?
It's on their graduate general's list.
Go higher than that. It needs to go higher than it. You need to. Then the reason I say that is because of this issue of evidence, arguments, try to deduce various kinds of conclusions, follow through on valid inferences. The evidence usually on the most crucial issues is underdetermined. So it's polyvalent. It's subject to a variety of different descriptions and interpretations. And Kuhn and Nelson Goodman and others used to make this point. But what Thomas Kuhn pointed out was scientific practices or social practices that are tied to different institutions and structures. What gets studied has much to do with who has access to the money. Where is it coming from? U.S. government contracts have a certain set of priorities that go with it. Private business corporations have a certain set of priorities that go with it. So that the whole conception of what it is to have a normal paradigm and then a critique of the normal paradigm in those institutions understanding themselves as scientific is something that needs to be contextualized, which is not to relativize and not to say that evidence does not matter. It's just that usually it's underdetermined, which means a whole host of other factors and variables that come into play regarding new breakthroughs, new developments. I just saw this movie called BPM, I think it is. It's about the ACT UP movement in France. 128 beats per minute, and the ways in which the activists, building on Boston ACT UP and New York ACT UP in the 80s, put pressure upon scientists to engage in the kind of investigation such that they could make more widely available these various kinds of medications and vaccines against vulnerable members of their society and vulnerable fellow human beings. And at that point, it was a matter of social movements shaping what was studied. One is you have to have a broad enough vision that allows for solidarity work across a number of issues. Because even among so-called progressives and leftists, they tend to be highly balkanized when it comes to very crucial issues. But one of the distinctive features of what I call loosely the neoliberal soulcraft is to convince the younger generation there is no alternative to the status quo and the system under which you live. So you can be as creative, innovative as you want, but you're still a tinkerer because the overall structure cannot be changed. So you come in with truncated imagination. And that truncated imagination has a limited vision. And all of that rich creativity gets filtered within that context that there is no alternative. I think what was exciting about my dear brother Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders is no revolutionary. I mean, I love my brother. He's a Brooklyn brother. He's no revolutionary, but as someone who talked about coming from a socialist tradition that carried with it a notion that there is an alternative, that we can think and authorize reality outside of the existing framework. And the tremendous impact he had. We know that, you know, if the fellow citizens in this country, if the only persons could vote were under 30, Bernie would be in the White House right now rather than Donald Trump. And that says something about the younger generation. Same is true with a poll now, right? You got more young brothers and sisters of all colors who prefer socialism over capitalism. Now you're asking what does socialism mean? Well, things get vague. What does capitalism mean? They're talking about predatory capitalism. They're talking about the highly Wall Street driven lack of accountability, escalating wealth inequality, no serious focus on poverty, wage stagnation, and so forth and so on. So you have to be very clear that these polls are very, very loose and vague. But there's this sense of the need for imagination. And this is true not just here, but all around the world. There are alternatives. Socially, economically, they're very difficult. They do build on what's in place. You don't work with a clean slate. But at the same time, you have to be able to think more broadly. And we've come out of a period where it was just almost, it was very, very difficult to convince young people that there was an alternative as opposed to just fitting in to the system and status quo. Things are beginning to become broader and looser, but I mean, we just hope it's not too late. I mean, the problem is that these catastrophes that I'm talking about, they are impending in such an intense way. And the authoritarian populisms that are taking over, Turkey and Kenya and India and USA, these are and neo-fascist folk emboldened everywhere you go. It's not just the United States. We just hope it's not too late. But whether it's too late or not, we got to commit ourselves to go down fighting. I mean, I come from a tradition that says it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. And it's got to be some sting in the swing in terms of hit, bite, analysis that keeps track of the least of these. And then you go down swinging and you pass it on to the younger generation with a smile. Got to keep a smile. Got to keep a smile because there's got to be some joy in it. If it's just done out of joylessness, then you're not going to be a long distance runner. Pricelessness. You're not going to be a long distance. You're not going to stay in it for long enough.
Oh, what's your definition of revolution? You call yourself a revolutionary Christian, but like, what does that mean?
Revolution in its generic sense is the transfer of power. The transfer of power from one set of individuals, group, or class to one that has to share power or a new emerging class or another group. A transfer of power. The American Revolution was not a transfer of power when it came to the social structure. It remained the same, but it was a revolution because the imperial elites were driven out. And you ended up with post-colonial elites who raised the question, can we govern ourselves? That was a transfer of power. George III and his cronies gone.
Yeah, I'm glad that.
So but that's a political revolution. There's different kinds of revolutions, so transfers of power in that way. There's cultural forms, there's economic forms, and so forth and so on.
Cool. Yeah, so that brings me to my first question, I guess, which is, so the American Revolution is a great example. It obviously didn't abolish racism.
It didn't involve what?
It didn't abolish racism or any sort of special oppression for that matter. Yeah.
It's predicated on white supremacist slavery. Go right ahead.
Clearly, so.
And indigenous people's land. Yeah. That was the first one.
Of course. So
that's the first one.
So that was like in the context of capitalism, right? So under capitalism, can you abolish these things like racism, transphobia, poverty, things that we interact with every day? which we feel like.
Well, the problem there, my brother, is that, again, you got to talk about institutional racism versus interpersonal racism and so forth. There's no doubt that certain progress can be made in terms of interpersonal racism in a capitalist civilization. You end up with a black president, there's no way. But I mean, the Ku Klux Klan has a Catholic running it, and the Klan was founded against Jews, Catholics, and especially black folk. So that's upward mobility American style. When you get a Catholic head of the Klan. And when I was there in Charlottesville, I saw some black folk march with the neo-Nazis. So America's a strange place. See what you see what I mean? So that I think generally speaking, when you talk about forms of transphobia, homophobia, patriarchy, and so forth, these are systems of domination that cut so deep that they can be manifested in under capitalist conditions, socialist conditions, communist conditions, and so forth and so on. I just think that if we have a radical, democratized, decentered form of engaging power so that we don't have accountability of elites at the top, lack of accountability of elites at the top, we can at least attenuate white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, and so on. But these structures of domination are not just so tied to capitalism. As soon as you overthrow capitalism, somehow they disappear. But certainly under this form of capitalism, deeply wedded historically in terms of its genealogy and the ways in which it reproduces itself. Oh, very much so. I don't think it can be attenuated in a serious way.
What's the relationship between political developments in the university and outside?
One of the wonderful things about educational institutions, higher learning, is that they all make claims to be involved in a quest for truth, even when they're unwilling to be truthful about their quest for truth. But it lends itself an openness so that you can have courageous voices inside of MIT telling the truth about some of MIT's down low activities. That's what scholarship is all about. And that's one of the great glories of liberal education. Because liberal education is not a site for fundamental transformative activity. See, MIT and Harvard and these places will never be fundamentally involved in the fundamental transformation of the status quo. It's like asking the Catholic Church to be somehow all followers of Dorothy Day. It's not going to happen. It's like asking for synagogues to follow Rabbi Heschel. Not going to happen. But the voices, the Heschels, the Days, the Chomskys, and so forth and so on, these magnificent voices up here, very much part of MIT, right? You all represent the MIT just as much as anybody else. But the dialogical clash takes place. So the truth that you talk about, let's tell it. But when it comes to fundamental transformation, you never look to Harvard and MIT. You got to look to social movements. You got to look to social movements. And those who are sensitive, those who care, they will respond to the social movement, you see, and become a part of it and play a crucial role in it. And those social movements can learn a lot from some of the smart folk at MIT. Because the folk at MIT who are very smart, they're not wasting their time. Smartness has its role. It just has its limitations. See what I mean? And social movements need some MIT folk who do their homework. I mean, I assume everybody does, but I mean, you got to add that just in case. But you see the point I'm making? No, absolutely, absolutely. So you never, again, you don't want to homogenize any institution. The variety of different voices, perspectives that are contesting here, and this is true for any place,
How do you balance that fast-moving sort of and keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening, particularly around youth and youth of color, while simultaneously existing in and navigating these spaces that don't even sometimes have rules to accommodate like your very existence?
You have to be improvisational. You got to be a jazz man, the man that you are. You move from one context to the next, preserve your integrity in each context, squeeze out the best of that context, hold at arm's length the worst, and keep moving. In that sense, it's far beyond multicultural. Being multi-contextual is much more important than multicultural. Because you can be multicultural and still find yourself in the same class silo. Same folk who are similar than you, they're just more colorful. But they still have their own parochialism. But if you're multi-contextual across community, cross-hood neighborhood, cross-class, cross-gender, cross-sexual orientation, And part of that has to do with just being in solidarity, you know. You see trans folk done it, show up at the rally. What you doing here? You supposed to be straight. Hey, this is a moral and spiritual and political issue. It's not a matter of my sexual orientation. I'm here because I care for you. Same is true with patriarchy, whatever it is, you see. The Jewish brother gets trashed. I'm here because I believe Jewish brothers and sisters ought to be treated with dignity. How come you were part of the Palestinian? Because I believe occupations are immoral, no matter who they are. It's a moral issue, spiritual issue. That's why. But that's multi-contextual. That's not just cultural, you see. And that's exactly what you're able to do in the academy, back to Detroit. And yours is, I guess, a bit transgenerational. I don't know how old you are, but I know you're a little older than some of the young brothers and sisters you're working with. I'm old school, you middling. and they new school. Is that fair?
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. So you got to be multi-contextual across generation. Absolutely. No, so I salute you, though, man.
I need to get past like this depression of like realizing the reality I live in is like much worse than I thought growing up. Yeah. And I'm wondering if like you all got to that point in your life and like what bolstered you to like continue moving forward despite so many things that seem wrong.
That is unconditional in terms of the love that we have. If we love our mamas, that is unconditional. Up, down, drunk, not drunk, whatever it is, we still love them. We got to love justice like that. No matter what the circumstance, no matter what, as America moves toward neo-fascism, we still have the same love, we just have deeper sacrifice, and we lose at the moment and you pass on the tradition. Under Obama, was certainly better than Trump, but that's not saying a whole lot now because Trump's got about as low bar as we can imagine, right? But even under Obama, you know, you got Wall Street executives not going to jail, but the poor and working classes filling up the jails. You got him citing explicitly, I'm on your side at Wall Street in that meeting he had in March of 2009. I stand between you and the pitchforks, but I'm with you. No, you say that to working and poor people. You don't say that to Wall Street if you are a freedom fighter. I don't care what color you are. You see? So even under Obama, it looked like things were so wonderful. 45 drone strikes under George Bush, 563 under Barack Obama. Some of us call George Bush a war criminal with 45. What does that make Brother Barack? War criminal too, you see. Now, when you say that, it's unpopular and so forth. I said it, who cares? I just try to tell the truth, keep moving, try to love everybody. But you have to be honest about other people's nightmarish reality so that the realities that we're experiencing now, folks in other parts of the world and other parts of the country were experiencing nightmarish realities under Obama. And we were just walking around thinking, oh, it's so nice to have that brilliant, poised black face as head of the American empire. Now we got that know-nothing, misogynist, racist face, head of the American empire, but it's still an empire. The structure's still in place, hierarchy's still in place, Wall Street's still in the driver's seat in terms of the highly financialized form of predatory capitalism that we're dealing with, the lack of serious accountability. So in that sense, even when you think back of the younger person, you say, oh, God, we all have different ways of waking up. And the wake up can't be just woman president, gay president, black president, more black professionals. Those are all positive things if they're a certain kind of folk. But in the end, we got to look deeper in terms of the realities that people are living in regard to some of these systemic issues. You see. And in that sense, I think we can then still be buoyed up and say, oh, even when I really should have been mad under Obama, I wasn't. Shame on me. I'm not going to visit that again. And I'm going to be a stronger fighter even under this escalating neo-fascist sensibility that we're seeing in White House tied to public bureaucracies, tied to courts and so forth, undercutting and legitimating of rule of law, all the things that go hand in hand with neo-fascist projects. But that's just the beginning to get at your question, though. The important thing, too, is here at MIT, you want to get some good friends, study hard, party hard, because you got 18 to 22. Those are certain years. You don't want to lose out on some of the good stuff.
How do you define unity in this nation so that institutional provincialism can be tamed? What does this unity look like?
I love the question. because it has to do with the interplay between the R-O-O-T-S and the R-O-U-T-E-S. Our roots, all of us, are thrown into time and space under provincial circumstances. Particular mom, particular dad, particular language or languages, particular culture, and so forth. Religious institution, civic institution, whatever it is. And we have to be rooted in that provinciality and dig deep enough to find the universality in those roots. And that's where the roots, the R-O-U-T-S, comes from. So when you're deeply grounded, like Martin Luther King Jr., preacher's kid, privilege, then petty bourgeois, Morehouse, Crozier, Seminary, BU. That's a particular slice of black community. That's not Louis Armstrong, right? On the street, orphan, a Jewish family that picks him up and so forth. Different class position. Both of them had the courage to dig deep into their roots to generate universal routes that embrace every corner of the globe, all peoples of the family that we call human beings. You see. So that we're not calling for an empty universalism that somehow ignores our root. MIT, in the way, this is a professional managerial formation site for elites in the science, technology, and sometimes military-industrial complex. The way right down the road, my institution is a place for the professional managerial elites, usually tied directly to ruling class formation, but then produce the whole, the Du Boises and other revolutionaries, right? So it means this what? That there's nothing wrong with being grounded in your roots, but you don't want to become blinded such that you can't make the connections with other people, learn from other people, listen to other people, so you end up an internationalist grounded in your particular roots. Now, there is a wonderful essay by Josiah Royce, who's probably the only great philosopher that emerged out of California, my native state, who taught at teaching at Harvard for 42 years. He wrote an essay called In Defense of Provincialism. Now, he's worth reading because based on what we're talking about, he defends provincialism against parochialism. Because he's crazy about Grass Valley, California. He wrote a novel on it at Harvard. Now, you write about Grass Valley at Harvard in the 1890s. It takes a lot of courage. Because Grass Valley is just a place for gold miners and so forth and so on. William James says, why are you wasting all your time on Grass Valley? Hey, I got some roots that the world needs to know about. We got something to teach the world. That's true for all of us.